Hi, everyone. Good afternoon. Thank you for joining us on this final panel on how to finance your startup. My name is Courtney Law. I am the Managing Director for Biolocity, and I'm joined by Tom Calloway and Brian Grulke. Today's panel discussion should be very exciting. Excited to talk about funding strategies, and we have a great panel here. And we'll talk a little bit about the various sources of funding for startups, as well as all the way from grants to venture funding and loans. So before we get started, I just want to introduce the panel. So as I said, I'm Courtney Law. I'm the Managing Director for Biolocity. We're a philanthropic fund that supports early stage healthcare technologies out of Emory and Georgia Tech. We have a consulting program, and we're a resource for the broader Atlanta and Georgia community. So let me turn it over to Brian, if you could do an intro.
Sure thing. I'm Brian Grulke. I'm a partner at Volcano Capital. So we're a family office set up when the family exited a medical device company called Vital Signs, which was sold to GE in 2008. And they took that capital and set up a family office and allocated a portion of that to do direct investment in early stage medical device startups. So we've been doing that for the last 11 years or so. And yeah, I've been keeping us pretty busy. So
great, thank you. And Tom?
Thank you for having me, Courtney. My name is Tom Calloway. I'm a venture partner in a company called Health Quest Capital. It's a venture firm which is focused on growth equity in growing medical device, diagnostics, healthcare information technology, and sort of innovation healthcare delivery systems. We've raised 3 funds, manage about $850 million. We're headquartered in California, but my offices are here in Atlanta, and we have partners scattered in Austin, Texas, and Florida, and other places. We have a portfolio of about 22 companies thus far. But what makes I guess what I was invited to this panel is that my roots are deep in Georgia. I joined Georgia Bio probably when I moved to Atlanta in 1997. Coming from the West Coast after a career in biotechnology. I had the good fortune to help establish Georgia Venture Partners, which was an early stage seed fund. Of course, Courtney and I were talking about how our relationships have extended through the universities here in Georgia. And so I know a lot about the resources and early stage capital there in our state as well.
Great, well, thank you. And so just for the audience, I've got some questions for us to start off with, but if you guys have any additional questions, please feel to share them and I'll try to get them incorporated in our discussion. So let's just get started. I guess my first question, so, you know, we have folks in the audience from all different stages of commercializations, from idea to probably people who are looking to raise some venture funding. So from your perspective, especially from your current positions, what industries and technologies are currently of interest to investors right now? And then what do you look for in a company before you start to invest?
Brian, I'll let you start.
Sure thing. Let's see. So, you know, we're definitely early stage investors. You know, we invest typically 2 to 3 million per round. And we kind of reserve about 10, 15 million just to support the company over the life of the through multiple rounds of financing. Let's see, as far as things we look for, first and foremost, I'd say a compelling clinical economic value proposition. And then, you know, we're looking at the whole mosaic of components that kind of make up a good investment. You know, one of the challenges with medical devices is that there's just a lot of different stakeholders, a lot of things to consider. So we check off all the boxes on, you know, regulatory strategy and reimbursement and the patent landscape and the management team and the amount of capital required to get to key value inflection points, and try to put all that together and get a sense for, you know, whether or not it makes sense.
I agree. We are, of course, this fund I'm currently with is a later stage fund. So we're investing probably a check size at where you conclude with $15 million to $20 million with reserves up to $100 million per investment that we make, just to let you know we can get that large. But let me step backwards though and think about earlier stage companies, because a lot of the members of our audience are looking for their first or second round of funding. I think our number one thing we're focused on is improvement in patient care and outcomes, because I think the payers and also, regulatory agencies are looking for quality of life and metrics of outcomes that they can actually demonstrate that a product or a service or technology is actually making a demonstrable difference in the patient's care. Without that, it's not an investable idea. If it saves money, that's a good thing. So if we can reduce costs, if it makes the life of a physician simpler and reduces the time that they need to spend with an information piece of technology or the time it takes to do a procedure, that's good as well. But the number one thing is got to improve the quality of life and reduce the costs around a patient's episode of disease or care.
And as far as sectors go, we focus specifically on medical devices. Within devices, obviously, I would first caution by saying, just because you're not in one of these sectors doesn't mean you can't get funding. You shouldn't just give up and go home. But as far as things that I would say generally are like quote unquote hot at the moment, I'd say is AI driven devices, things in the electrophysiology field or venous field. And then for a while there, things were really hot because of COVID and the diagnostics and remote patient monitoring space. But I'm not sure how long that will keep going.
And I agree with you on that, Brian. I think the other thing we look for is, you're right. We keep talking about a consumer-driven healthcare economy. I think that COVID really drove that home. I don't know how many of you have ordered a kit to, test yourself for COVID and then send it back to the laboratory. But we are now seeing companies like we've invested in Everlywell, which is a at-home diagnostics company that's focused exclusively on providing at-home solution sets. So anything we could keep people away from the hospital or away from expensive care is becoming a more important thing. So that's one of the hot areas we look at. The other is we've been amazed at the revolution of diagnostics and the fact that molecular diagnostics costs have just plummeted to the floor, for good and for bad. It's bad in that the people who pay for it are realizing it's cheap, and so therefore they're reducing their reimbursements for it. But on the other hand, the ability to do diagnostics rapidly, quickly, and at huge volume, COVID has taught us this. We can actually do sequencing really fast, which is opening up a whole new area of cancer diagnostics. We have invested in a company called Castle Biosciences that can not only tell you that your melanoma is there, but also whether it's going to progress rapidly or not. So we can withhold care from those who don't need aggressive care, and we can scarily tell people that their melanoma is going to progress quickly and give them more aggressive treatment. So patient selection is becoming more important as well. So those are some of the areas we're interested in.
Oh, wonderful. And great feedback. And it's great that you guys are, in your current positions, you're a little bit different as far as the timing that you're funding folks, but you both have had experience working with people who are even a little bit earlier. And so when people are trying to even prepare to get to the stage where you guys are at for funding, what are some things that you think that they should be considering, either resource-wise, like local resources, like Tom, you've been here in Georgia, what connections can they make, or even what are things they should be thinking about funding-wise for folks who are a little bit earlier than you guys?
I always advise entrepreneurs to first check on your own personal support system. So make sure your spouse or your loved one or your family is okay with this, and you got some financial resources, because there's going to be some risk here that you're going to be taking in order to spend some time doing your startup or working on your deal. So I think that's probably your number one thing. And then the second thing I usually advise advisors, be careful. If somebody is a friends and family round and you're really raising money from friends and family, make sure they are friends and family and understand they are doing high risk capital. And you don't want to damage relationships. I've done this before, where you have a deal, you put a lot of people in that are your friends, and then the deal goes south. You need to have those relationships, let them understand that this is more than just doing me a favor. This is actually, you're investing in a business and there's risks associated with that. Would you agree, Brian?
100%. I think you can make for some very awkward Thanksgiving dinners if you take family money and then lose it.
Especially if it's your father-in-law. Yes.
It could definitely some downsides. The other thing I would caution on friends and family rounds is that they tend to be less sophisticated investors, and to your point, may not be as aware of the risks involved, because you tend to only hear about successful startups, not all the ones that don't make it all the way to that point. And there's maybe the temptation to try to get terms more favorable to the company than it might deserve at that stage, which can, in my opinion, really complicate fundraising when you're going to more professional investors down the line. So for instance, let's say you raise capital from friends and family at a 20 million pre, and then you go to raise money from professional VCs and they say it's worth 10 million pre. Well, that's an awkward conversation to have. One, with your friends and family that put a stake in you early and supported you early, but also something that a lot of professional VCs won't touch because it's ripe for lawsuits and disgruntled shareholders, and it's frankly legally a lot more difficult and complex to do than a more standard up round.
I used to suggest to people, Brian, I'm curious to know what you do. I used to suggest that they put their early money in a convertible note that converts in the first professional round. Do you still advise that of early stage entrepreneurs, or what do you think?
So that's a great question. Let's see. So
Sorry, Courtney, I don't mean to take.
Oh, no, this is great.
I just didn't know if that was still a theme of like convertible notes as opposed to doing a direct investment.
Mm-hmm.
So if you're taking small dollars, 50, 100K from friends and family that aren't professional investors, then I actually think a convertible note or a safe or some similar instrument is actually probably appropriate. That being said, at Volcano, we always prefer a priced equity round. We just don't think that the typical discounts you see in the market of 10, 20, even 30% adequately compensate you for the risk, the early stage risk you're taking, as a general rule of thumb, unless you cap it, in which case it's actually better for us. But no smart entrepreneur would do that, in my opinion. And then the second thing is, you lose all the governance that you would get in a typical preferred round. So you're not on the board, you don't have native control rights, you don't have anything that a typical preferred investor would have. And second of all, you're converting into some round you don't even know the terms of. So you're speaking as the investor rather than as the owner of the company. Is that what you're saying? Yeah. So I would say, as Volcano Capital, we do not make de novo investments in convertible debt. But if I was a startup founder, I think it's probably a good vehicle, particularly if your investors are not as educated. Mm-hmm. What are your thoughts?
Well, I agree with that. I just want to make sure the audience understood you're talking about as Volcano, you would not make a convertible note debt. But I'm saying if you're looking at a deal and the investors had established a valuation of 20 million and you saw it as 10 million, that there's going to be a lot of pain at that Thanksgiving dinner table. If they'd done the same investment, but did it in convertible note at some discount to the first professional round, so they get a 20% discount to what you're going to invest in, would that be an easier pill to swallow?
Yeah, so we'll invest into companies that have convertible notes all the time, right? But it's a priced equity round and traditional VC kind of structure for us personally.
Right.
And to follow on to this, because I get questions about this a lot from folks who are like, well, what if we don't have friends and family? What are the other opportunities? And some people will look at either crowdsourcing, which people have opinions on that, or they try to build themselves up in other ways, like a lot of non-dilutive funding. And so what do you think about those opportunities? Well, like what are other sources you can look at if you don't have friends and family to really get that seed going?
Free money is best. How's that? Loans, grants, universities, there's a lot of resources. Georgia's got a wealth. And Courtney, I'd like to hear more about what you're doing in terms of the funds that you have available. So if you wouldn't mind, I'm going to turn the tables on you. But the great thing is that Georgia has set up a whole infrastructure system for early stage companies to grab resources, particularly if it's based on Georgia University's intellectual property. And we're delighted that there's a lot of foundations around town that have supported entrepreneurs to hire staff, to find mentors, to get people started on the pathway of commercialization, with the idea, of course, not only of capitalizing the intellectual property coming from the universities, but also looking ahead towards creating jobs and employment, which is part of the mission of the Georgia Research Alliance, for instance, and others. So, Brian?
Yeah, so there's a lot of grant funding opportunities available. It depends a little bit on your particular niche and what funding sources might be most appropriate. So if there's a potential military application, there's a lot of DARPA funding and things in that realm. There's NIH grants, SBIR grants. There's like a lot of resources out there that benefits doing some digging and looking for those. Some complications though I find with the grant funding is that one, you need someone to actually write it, and it's kind of a unique genre of writing into and of itself. So sometimes you need to pay someone to write the grant for you. Second of all, it tends to be long timelines between when you apply and when you actually get approved and when you actually receive the funds, some of which are actually reimbursements. So they don't even, you have to have other money to spend it and then you get reimbursed for it. And then the third watch out I'd say is sometimes the grant funding might be for work that wasn't on your actual plan. So you might be trying to go in this direction and the grant would take you in this other direction. And you have to think long and hard as to whether or not that makes sense.
Yeah,
Courtney,
absolutely.
tell us about your program, about how it works. I'm sorry to put you on the spotlight.
Yeah, no,
But
absolutely.
you actually are the early non-dilutive and other sources of capital in Georgia.
Yes, yeah. So great segue. So Biolocity, we fund early stage entrepreneurs who are coming out of Georgia Tech and Emory. So our funding is limited to folks who have intellectual property housed at either one of the institutions. However, like you mentioned, there are folks like the Georgia Research Alliance and other groups within our community who do this early stage funding, but primarily coming out of the institutions. But one thing that Biolocity is a part of is what's called the BARDA Drive Accelerator Network, which is a part of the Department of Human Health and Services. And so what we do is we meet with technologies that don't have to be Emory or Georgia Tech based. They can be anywhere in the ecosystem, or they don't even have to be in the state. But we can talk to them about the BARDA's area of interest around health security and really actually broker that discussion between them. Like, hey, here's an idea. For example, one of their current areas of interest is sepsis. And so we can work with companies to get their pitch deck ready to meet with folks within the granting agency and talk through their technology. So like you said, free money is the best money. So a little non-dilutive funding, but mechanisms like that offer up to, I believe they offer up to $750,000 grants. So there are pros and cons, like you guys weighed in. You do have to write the grant. The timeline to get the grant can be long, but it can bring in quite a bit of capital if you're still in the proof of concept stage of your technology.
One of the biggest challenges I've run into in early stage companies is you have an inexperienced faculty member or inventor or creator who has never done it before, and he or she is looking for capital. And, first round capital is the hardest, as you know. And it always seems to me that, and my advice to all these folks is usually go find a mentor, go find somebody who's actually done it before and ride their coattails as best you can, because they usually have a pathway into capital or pathway into the high net worth individual groups that you're going to try to reach into. And if you convince them that they are believers in your technology, your platform, or your business plan, not only can they give you a good critique of what you're doing, but they also can give you access to folks and networks that you wouldn't get otherwise. And I do agree with Brian. The funding sources are there, but they are slow. And maybe the fastest way to this is if you really have a great idea and a plan that matches it, then finding somebody who can help guide you to the sources of capital may be the fastest way.
Yeah, no, that's great. I think that's a great point as well, having mentors. One thing that I stress to different entrepreneurs, one mentor may not be the mentor you have for every stage of your company. Sometimes you have mentors who are in that initial stage and they are more generalists. They can help you, like, here are the things you should think about. And then maybe your mentor / advisor group grows and changes as your company grows and changes. And it is good to have folks who've been there, done that, to help you help advise you along the way. And so, oh, go ahead.
I was going to add that, yeah, I definitely think networking is the key to all non-friends and family or grant-based financing sources, so just be creative. I would say cold outreach works as well, but find other startups in your space that got funded, and see who they got to invest, and if you can get an intro from them. And they're usually in different areas, startup lawyers that can put you in touch They know some of the key investors in the portfolio companies or companies that they do legal work for. Are happy to make those introductions. So just got to be scrappy and persistent, and try to broaden that network as much as you can, because there's not a great list of investors out there. There are some you can buy, but I haven't done it, and I don't know how. I can't vouch for the quality of it.
We use PitchBook a lot. So yeah, I was going to suggest there's two tools that we use a lot. I mean, I must advise all young entrepreneurs that LinkedIn is an amazing search tool. I mean, even if they won't connect with you, you can find out who is the founder, who is involved in the company that you found. So, and Google the company, Google the founders, and figure out how to. And most people will respond to you because they are interested in helping other entrepreneurs if they're successful. The second is PitchBook is great. So if you can get access through the universities, particularly, there's an online database that shows you who are the investors in the companies and which rounds and what amounts. And so you can sort of see who is the funding sources behind those early stage companies. Again, we're getting later stage now, Brian. We're already moving beyond your startup, but I do think that PitchBook is a great resource for looking up financial information.
And that's a great point. So I guess to follow up on that, how do entrepreneurs know that they're ready so we're friends and family, we're doing seed funding, maybe we've got some grants. How do you know when you're ready for that next stage? Like when you're ready to go to angel funding? When should you consider loans? Like what is the thought process as you move forward to more and more and greater amounts of funding?
Brian?
So it's a tough question to answer, because I think every investor has kind of different criteria, different stage, different kind of entry points in terms of funding. But as far as Volcano Capital goes, we're pretty flexible. Being a family office, we don't have LP agreements that restrict kind of what type of investments we make, and so we've considered everything as early as an idea on a napkin for a space we know really well and know the business very well. I would say our typical entry point is there's a team, maybe some provisional patents filed, some prototypes, some initial clinical work that shows that it's working, and then a solid business plan that kind of walks through each of the major components of regulatory, reimbursement, commercialization, and puts together a cohesive plan that makes sense. And that's kind of where we typically get involved. We don't typically build a company from scratch, so we don't go out to university, find a technology, build a team around it, and then put money in. We like a little bit more fully baked than that, but we'll get in very early.
And unfortunately, for this group, maybe we're a later stage than that. So we're looking for a product that's already been FDA approved, if it's a medical device or something that needs to be regulated. A lot of our things are not necessarily regulated because there are services that are enhanced by information technology or some novel solution set. But we want to see a serial entrepreneur who has had a successful exit or two, who has now built a management team and who has a customer list that we can call, and a potential customer list that we can also call and check in on competitors that we know about, because we're stroking a larger check, and we're more interested in seeing a rapid growth curve, doubling in size over the next 3 or 4 years. Our typical companies have, maybe 10 million to 15 million in revenue and are doubling for the next 3 or 4 years to get to 100 million in revenue, and then we'll sell them at 5x or whatever. That's sort of our strategy. Speaking as an early stage entrepreneur, like a venture capitalist I used to be, stepping back into that, our number one thing was, who is the leader of the company, and does he or she have a good milestone-driven plan that I can understand how we're going to need additional financing and how we're going to be diluted going forward, and how we will make the bubble bigger so that as the dilution occurs, our investment continues to rise in value over time with appropriate exits. So I want to see a full map from where we are today to exit. And that's our number one thing. And then we need to understand what are the capital raises that are going to happen between where we are today and that exit, so that we can understand whether we're going to need to syndicate or partner or come up with more capital, so that we don't get caught in what we call a dry powder crisis, where nobody around the table has money. And so we take that incredible down round, Brian, as you know, where you suddenly get squished because nobody was there to help support the company through its next stage of financing. So.
Yeah, that's the critical risk, I think, for early stage investors. So managing a cram, trying to do everything you can to avoid the cram down round and reduce the risk of that is critical to get a good return. You know, we try to think about it a number of different ways, that risk specifically. One is just to try to get lower cash need companies. So we don't invest in PMAs that are, you know, very complex and going to take a lot of capital and long timelines. So we try to focus on the lower risk 510K regulatory pathway. And then we like to try to have, you know, the capital needs to a point where either we can do it entirely by ourselves if we need to. Obviously, if we can find other co-investors at an up round, great. Or if we can't do it all by ourselves, to have the syndicate in place from the get-go so that you can continue to fund the company to exit with just the people that are around the table at the beginning. So those are kind of the two ways that we think about syndication risk, essentially.
Yeah, no, that is great feedback and great for thinking through what considerations that entrepreneurs should be thinking about when they come to meet people like yourselves. So what other considerations, or even things like what should they be watching out for while they're fundraising? What are some potential pitfalls that you could see that would be a non-starter for folks like you to invest?
My number one thing is, well, we want to hear the story about for the first time only. You know, this is the first in its kind, because we don't want to hear that you're doing a lookalike of something else. You know, we're just like whatever. And then on the other hand, we don't want you to conclude your statement by saying there's no competitors in the space. So I think that the worst thing is somebody says, we say, well, who's your competition? And they say, we have none. And that means you have not done your due diligence. We know we've been listening to pitches all day and probably have heard 2 of those pitches this week. So I would suggest be cautious about your words in those sorts of comments. So anyway,
Brian. I think for me, I think the first goal of the entrepreneur should be to try to convince, you have to sell me that it's worth my time to do due diligence. And so, you know, just to share the mentality of a VC, it's like they're seeing many companies a day come across their desk. And if you spend 2 months of research on every one of them, you're going to be more busy you could ever possibly hope for. So from a VC mentality, the idea is how quickly can I kill this startup idea and make it a non-starter? So they're looking for that fatal flaw so they can just say no and get on to the next one. And so, you know, from the beginning, it's more about why should I invest my time in this? And so it's about having a cohesive plan that actually makes sense and has a shot of hanging together and working, but also the credibility to execute that plan and realistic expectations around valuation and things. So yeah, I think that's kind of the first watch out is anything that would mess that up. Then the second is more or less like I look at the way the entrepreneur does in due diligence as an indication for what working with them more long term would be like. So if they're really responsive, that's a great thing. If I feel like they're hiding information and not giving me the full truth, I think that's a really bad sign. If they're really defensive, that's a really bad sign. You know, so there's all these kind of watch outs that you learn through the course of interacting with them. I think that's, and I'll say even from before you're looking for money. So sometimes people just ask you for advice, and I'll pay attention to what, you know, what's their plan, how they, you know, where do they want to be next year, and they'll come and check in. And I'll be like, like how they do versus what they said. You know, are they consistently delivering? So that when they come ask me for money at the end of the day, I have a gut feeling for all these people credible. Are they actually making progress and meeting their plans? And that gives me a lot more confidence to write a check down the line if they are.
I'll agree with that, Brian. I'll endorse you that, you know, you showed us a slide deck a year ago. We'll go back and look at those numbers while you're showing us a slide deck today, and we'll ask questions based upon your previous slide deck to see if you actually hit your numbers and are doing what you expected to do. So we're pretty skeptical if you are changing your story, you know, whatever. The other thing I wanted to make sure that you know, you don't have to, first of all, don't make the picture too big. Don't say, you know, diabetes is a big problem in America and we're working on diabetes. Everybody knows that. Tell me specifically what is the pain point that you're working to solve, and what is it specifically within diabetics or within whatever therapeutic area you're going into? What are you actually solving that is clearly stated and understandable. So I can see that there's value going to be created if you can solve that problem and then go about it. I also, Brian, to your point, I would add that you need to not only have a easy, understandable, digestible slide set, but you also need to have all the data behind it that backs it up, and additional slides, additional papers, additional whatever that you can reach into your box and show me anytime I ask you a question. Because if you don't have the backup behind that initial, 20 slide deck that you're presenting off of, we will doubt your credibility and you'll lose a lot of points right away. Did you agree?
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, and I think along those lines, so say, an entrepreneur we've risen above the noise, we're going to have a meeting with you guys. What does that first meeting look like? What should be some realistic expectations after a first meeting? Because I think you're setting up like, here are the types of things that we want to hear. And I've heard, making sure that you're seeing the whole picture, maybe even some milestones. Like what should entrepreneurs do to prepare for an initial meeting with a VC?
Now it's interesting that we can see you without having to have you meet with us. In fact, it's probably rare. This is why we can do even this call today. And I think that we've made investments now without even officially meeting the management team. Is rare, but I mean, we usually, one of us tries to go fly to whatever city and go meet with the whole team. But and also the teams are dispersed themselves. So a lot of times people are dialing in from all over, much like we're doing today. But I think the number one thing is you want to make sure that all the key decision makers or all the key team members are on the screen with you and are there and credible, and make sure that you've rehearsed and practiced so that you have a ringleader, probably the CEO, most likely, as describing it, and is there to present his membership team and let them illustrate their own backgrounds and how they're relevant to the story that we've got. I think that's most important. And then have a very clear and concise slide deck that you walk through in front of the members of the investment committee or the decision-making body. And of course, you don't want to stutter or stop, and you want to be able to go slow enough that people can absorb the information, but quickly enough knowing that we're going to see 3 more in that next hour, and we want to get past you and into the next one very quickly. So your job is to pique our interest, at least on the first meeting, and not to try to sell us all the way through. You're just trying to get us to say, yes, we'd like to do some due diligence on this. Brian, you think so?
Yeah, that's the key goal, I think, coming out of the first meeting, is to get the investor to, first of all, invest their time or their team's time to diligence the opportunity. So I think that's definitely the critical piece there. I think everything that you said around credibility and making sure the story is coherent and hangs together and is compelling and makes you want to invest your time, I think that's all the key components to it. One question I was thinking of is controversy. Would you sign an NDA if the investor, the startup, asked you to?
We have our own NDA, yes.
So you will.
Well, not an NDA, but we have our own lawyer-approved NDA. One of the challenges we have with NDAs, the VCs typically have, is we see lots of companies in the same space. And if we make an investment in another company in your same area, then did we use information you disclosed to us, or did we share that information? And we agree we will not share information with anyone else, but it doesn't mean we won't use that information in our own heads to evaluate the market or the size of the market or, competition.
Yeah, so we're in the same boat. Like, so we will sign an NDA. We'll typically use our own form just to save legal costs.
Right.
But at the same time, I've never seen an NDA actually enforced. So my general rule of thumb is, if you feel like you really need an NDA, like, maybe you shouldn't be pitching to that person if you don't trust them. It's my general rule of thumb. But yeah, I think obviously it's one thing that I think that's controversial with VCs, is whether or not they will.
I think NDA is probably more important when you're talking to a strategic partner or acquirer, because they can quickly steal an idea or use an idea if it's not patented yet and it's just an invention. Don't you think? I mean, if you're trying to get Medtronic or Boston Scientific at your table, then having an NDA in place with them before you start conversations might be more important. That's
critical. Yeah, my opinion, if you're dealing with a VC and you want a VC to sign an NDA, like, yeah, okay, fine. I'm not sure if it really means anything, but yeah, you should sign one, I guess. But when it comes to strategics, I think it's mandatory. I still think that enforceability is a real issue. I've been in this industry for 11 years, and I'll say that it's maybe a little more sharp elbow than I had fully appreciated when I first started. So I think all the things you mentioned with stealing, stealing an idea or altering their competitive strategy as a result of information you show them, like all that's risk. And I've actually seen it. I have not been able to figure out how to enforce anything now. So, so I think you should think long and hard before you approach those people, strategics. And as an early stage funding source, maybe not. Maybe you wait closer to the goal line where you have more of a head start.
Yeah, at Georgia Venture Partners, we never signed an NDA because we were hearing so many things from so many different people. We just couldn't have the legal cost to add to that. We were investing $500,000 in a deal, so it's kind of small.
Great. Oh, and for the audience, again, if you guys have any questions, happy to incorporate them in the discussion as well. So I wanted to ask, just step a little bit back. So we've talked a little bit about how to approach you guys, and then how to start off with the initial funding. But there are probably things that you should continue to consider at every stage of funding. So what advice would you give for entrepreneurs as they continuously raise capital? Any additional advice?
I mean, one piece of advice I would suggest is you should always raise more than you need. Entrepreneurs are always concerned about dilution, and rightly so. But I've also seen very few companies hit their deadlines early. So like the bias is always towards delays, and so in that respect, it's always good to have an extra buffer, so to speak. And then the next piece is, once you hit the milestone and you go to raise capital, if you want to be aggressive, you'd say 6-month timeline to get the capital in the door. But if you want to be more conservative or more prudent, I'd say suggest even 9 months of runway to get to funding. And so, you need to hit that milestone and allow for that runway. So you need a lot more than maybe you'd think. So that'd just be one piece of advice.
I totally agree with that. I always tell everybody, plan your milestone, make it long, hit it early. Also have money to go past what milestone you said you're going to hit, so that you can make sure that you have enough time to raise capital. The other is, once investors are in bed with you, they don't want to be diluted either. So, to some degree, you're hopefully going to create a syndicate out of your current investor group to help you raise capital for the next round. So make sure that those people who put their personal pocketbooks on the line, or the small funds that went in with you, are helping seek additional capital, as I call friendly capital, that's going to look at not trying to screw you or do a cram round on you. So that's probably important as well. I must say it's interesting working in the larger fund. Valuation, unless it's totally out of whack, is not as our biggest concern. Our concern is the failure of the company, or the failure of the management team to deliver on the service, the product, the delivery of what they're supposed to do. And our biggest issue is reimbursement, is the second biggest issue that we have to deal with. Whether the CMS or whomever is going to be paying for this product is going to take away the current established number and put a different number on top of it. A lot of the products we sell are into the Medicare marketplace, and so therefore Medicare is a big player in the kinds of products and services we're selling. And if they change on a dime, which it can kill a company, whatever. But as an early stage entrepreneur, I agree with you, Brian, totally. You got to make more money. You got to reserve money to get to the next round of funding. You need to be able to demonstrate you can hit your milestone within the window that you have, because that'll be credibility. That will build credibility with your next round of funding. The other thing, Brian, I really believe in is the soft pitch. Even before you're ready to raise money and you're looking a couple months before you're starting around and your milestones look like they're going to line up, it's time to start calling on the next round of people and start making hellos, so that when you say, can I come pitch you, or who would you recommend I pitch to? Because the people are always looking for deals. I mean, the market for money is interesting. It's a two-way street. We're looking for good deals all the time. I mean, that's what we're looking to do. We're looking to put money to work. And I know you're seeking money, but there are people out there that are trying to put money to work to get a return on their investment, and also to help science and technology. Without science, we would not have beat COVID. So I always remind people that it was science, that did this. So anyway, there's a lot of people who are interested in healthcare investing.
Awesome. And we actually have a few questions from the audience. So I'll start sharing some of those as well. First question is, I heard about investors wanting to have a timed vested shares for the founders when they start the company. Can you comment on time vested shares for founders?
This is a great question. Let's see. So from my perspective, it doesn't really, it matters to me insofar as if I have to replace the CEO. Now I've got to grant options to incentivize the new CEO, right? But the way most VC deals are written, the options come out of the pre-money. So it doesn't really matter too much if it's your first time investing in that company, one way or the other. However, if I was an entrepreneur and I had multiple co-founders alongside me, I would 1000% have time-based vesting on all of them, because I've seen a couple of instances where things got really acrimonious because they'd start a company together, 50-50 equity, and then one would quit 6 months later. And is it really fair that that person has the same equity stake as the one who's putting blood, sweat, and tears in for 5 years, 10 years? It's like, no, the answer is no. So personally, I think it's a really good idea, particularly if you have multiple founders.
Yeah, and I totally agree with you, Brian. I think you're distinguishing between an operating founder or executive of the company as opposed to a founder who had the idea and created the company. Don't you think? I mean, like any CEO, you would have a pool of equity set aside for those people who are running the company. Should that person no longer be the CEO or the leadership of the company, they would lose their remaining time on their vesting clock. So I would suggest there's a founders pool and then there's a management pool. And you basically, if the founders are management, then they would be part of the 15% set aside for management.
Yes, correct.
That idea, something like that.
Yeah, exactly.
Great. Another question that came in is, when you invest in university startups, have you had issues with the license agreement startup company? With the license agreement the startup company had with the university? And if so, how do you deal with them?
So, I mean, I can take a first stab at it, or if you want to do.
I'll be quick then. I'll turn it over to you because this is your space. But I'll tell you that we have negotiated and then renegotiated and renegotiated terms with the university. So it's a evolving thing based upon how successful you are. The universities, of course, start off by saying everything's created as valuable and as ours, which is a challenge. The worst thing I've ever heard was when a person did work at one of your major universities and then claimed that it was his because he did it in his basement. I hate to tell him or her that they are an employee of a university and have signed a contract with that university, and that intellectual property does not belong to him or her. So I think that's the number one, to get clarity with your founder that, just because you're doing it on your spare time, if you're actually an employee, you got to look very carefully at your employment responsibility. So, but I would say Georgia's universities, because a lot of them, particularly tech, are focused on commercialization, they have licensing policies and plans in place to help entrepreneurs get started. Back to you, Brian.
Yeah, so generally speaking, I'd say it varies a lot depending on what institution you're talking to and how kind of commercially oriented they are. I have seen some issues if universities are more familiar doing deals with, say, biotech pharma, and then try to apply kind of the same sort of metrics or deal structure or deal amounts on the device side. And they're very different markets, very different licensing and typical licensing deals. So I think that's one watch out. But by and large, I'd say they've been pretty reasonable from what I've seen. And the best time to renegotiate it is before you put in your check. It tends to be a pretty good chip because their royalty is worth nothing if it ever generates any sales, right? So and the funding landscape being what it is, it's not so easy to raise funding. So if you're willing to put in a check, I've found that the tech transfer offices tend to be pretty accommodating as long as you're like reasonable and relatively on market. And so, yeah, to Tom's point, we've renegotiated subsequent funding rounds as the situation changes. Maybe we're no longer using the IP, so we can cut a deal to reduce it, or there's all sorts of things you can do depending on the needs of the company. But I found them by and large to be pretty working, pretty good to work with.
You know, Emory has been pretty innovative. They created the program called Drive around pretty much Dennis Leota's antiviral laboratory and stuff like that. They created a institution away, not for profit, which is creating for-profit assets with a set licensing agreement run by my former partner, David Perriman. And it's been a very good model. The problem with pharmaceuticals, particularly like Brian's saying, they're used to just licensing the molecule and the molecule creates the value. So therefore there's just a royalty back to the university from a pharmaceutical company who does all the development. That's very different than doing a startup from scratch. So.
Awesome, great questions, and keep them coming if you have any others. So back to, I guess, the university question, because some, I know that some VCs, they wait until they're ready to be approached after folks already have a license and they are out, they are spun out of the university. But it sounds like you guys have invested in folks that are currently within the university. So how early, I guess, at that point are you looking at companies?
Back in the good old Georgia Venture Partners days, we would sit down with the professor and an idea and a napkin and sort of map out what it should look like. I think our challenge in those days was talent and finding somebody who actually has commercialized a product rather than finding intellectual property or great ideas. And I think that one of our challenges is being in Georgia is we are a little bit myopic and we forget that there's other areas of the United States and the world that are also developing technologies in competition with us. So one of my suggestions is finding a good commercialization partner to partner up with the inventor founder, as we talked about, is probably the most important thing, where we can start looking at what does an investment look like and how can we start a company around this thing. Because I think there's a big leap between a professor's experiment and pet project to a company. And I think that you need a pair of eyes and somebody who can take that company leadership to get it to fruition. Brian?
Yeah, huge leap. Fully agree that talent tends to be the main gating factor on our side. And that's why we specifically don't go start companies ourselves. We like to have that team kind of already in place. So typically what we'll see on the if we're going to fund a new startup that's dealing with the OIT office or whatever, is usually they'll have like a free option on it for like some period of time, and they'll have a team in place, maybe working for free or for equity, and then a business plan. And then they go and they try to go shop that and say, this is, we have this option, we've got, this plan, it's worth investing in, like, write your check. I would say that's the typical model if we're now dealing with licensing technology, if we're involved in licensing it. Otherwise, the other angle tends to be with one of our portfolio companies likes a new technology that they found through university. Then sometimes we'll deal with them on working on getting the technology out.
Great. And we actually had another question from the audience around university licensing. So who should be negotiating the university license for a startup? Not the founder, I presume. If a lawyer, who do you pay for? Who do you pay for it if you're trying to raise money? Who pays for that person?
Ooh, all right. So yeah, so you always need counsel for the company, and the tricky part is they are super expensive. So the last one we were dealing with is using Wilson Sonsini, which is not a cheap firm. I mean, great firm, not cheap.
West Coast firm, yes.
Yeah. So yeah, I think that's what you need your friends and family funding for, in my opinion, is to try to get that in place. Because it's difficult to get a deal done without it. The other option is to try to, if you're really convincing, maybe you can run up a bill, get the deal done, and then reimburse the lawyer out of the proceeds of the round. Tricky, possible, but tricky. I don't think it's very likely.
I think in the good old days, we were able to find lots of law firms that had intellectual property groups that were hungry for early stage clients. And they, not that they would give it for free per se, but they would give us a significant discount to go and start the process, mainly because they wanted to have good relations with the universities who spend lots of money on intellectual property. So there, and actually my suggestion, I won't mention their names because I don't want you flooding their mailboxes, but if you look at the Georgia Bio board of directors, you'll see attorneys and the names of attorneys. And usually those are the intellectual property attorneys in Atlanta who are making a practice out of early stage companies. And so therefore they would be folks that you might want to call when you have an idea, particularly if it's coming out of one of Georgia's universities, because they typically have good relations and know what can and cannot be done. And also they are trying to walk both sides of the street to help their universities start companies and also work for the universities on protecting their own intellectual property. So the big money is at the universities. And so therefore, if you're trying to license something out, they can walk the other side of the street as well.
I do agree with Tom. I think having someone that's familiar with that particular institution, not just licensing deals generally, I think is super helpful, because you're not going to waste time beating your head against the wall asking for something that that institution is just not willing to give on.
I think Wilson Sonsini would probably do an abysmal job trying to get a license for you.
They worked closely with that particular institution.
Well, they would probably you would spend a fortune on that just getting started. So there goes your first $500,000 done.
Yeah, it can add up pretty quickly. They're not cheap.
I'm sorry, we're being recorded. We've used them as well. They're very good. So.
Another follow-up question was, how much are you involved in license agreement negotiation if you're investing in a startup that is not licensed their technology with the university?
So if it hasn't been licensed yet, then obviously we'll get involved. So we need to make sure that the terms are acceptable to us as potential investors, but ultimately we're not in a position to really influence it. It's really up to the CEO and their counsel to really drive the process. But we'll definitely highlight areas that are concerning to us. But at the end of the day, they have to negotiate the deal. It is what it is, and then we can either choose to invest or not invest.
I agree. We used to spend a lot of time at the technology offices, in Georgia, all over the place, helping companies and thinking about things. And I'm not saying it's a pleasure not doing that anymore, but I don't do that anymore. So it's good.
Yeah, I would also say it's definitely not our typical deal. I'd say for the most part, it's usually already in place.
We're usually checking the license to make sure the terms are acceptable so that if we do reach commercial success, we're not paying a 10% royalty back into the company,
Exactly. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. And if we do check and see that, that's when we go and renegotiate, and now we're involved.
Or we walk away.
Or you walk, yeah.
No, this has been a great conversation. And I think in our last few minutes, I wanted to give you guys a chance to share any final thoughts of, what should these entrepreneurs be thinking about as they're trying to finance their startup, whether it's pitfalls or things to think about, or just an overall strategy.
One thing maybe Tom could weigh in on actually is the debt side. I don't think we've touched on that one yet.
Well, it's interesting that venture debt is the thing. There's a lot of Silicon Valley Bank, a lot of other people who are out there looking for companies. Of course, they're typically looking for companies that have revenues and are interested in finding capital to sort of help them reach the next level of growth rather than just a startup per se. I don't think they'll get into the earliest stages of where we're talking about now. They used to, and I think they've burned themselves too many times and have stepped back. The advantages of using debt, of course, is it's non-dilutive, and it usually has some warrants attached to it. So they do own some of your shares, but on the front end, it's non-dilutive to the people around the table who've already invested in the company. The downside is that when you have a liquidation event or you're not doing well and you are winding down the company, they have first priority over the shareholders, even the preferred shareholders. So therefore, they're first at the table if there's money coming in the door. Now, like the license we discussed, everything can be negotiated. So if the company's going to get less money than it thought as you're selling it or getting rid of it, you can negotiate terms again. But But debt financing is another non-dilutive source of capital, and there are markets for that. It's particularly useful as we're preparing to go public, and we need that last, as Brian's saying, you don't want to run out of cash while you're running off the cliff. You want to make sure that you've got substantial legs underneath you to get you to the next stage. And that's where a debt financing vehicle, since you're going to have an immediate financing or some other way to pay them back, coming up is a good way to go. I don't know, Brian, how you use debt.
Yeah, quite similarly. I mean, I'd say, yeah, one is a convertible note if you're already an investor, and that's more bridging to the next round. And I think one of the things you said earlier is once the investor puts their money and you're all kind of in the same boat, you don't want to cram down rounds. So they're willing to do things as existing investors that they wouldn't do as a de novo investment. Yeah, then venture debt, I totally agree. I think it's a great way to lever up, but works amazing if the value of the company keeps going up, and works much less amazing the valuation is going the other direction. Typically they'll do kind of up to half the size of the equity check. And yeah, at some point you do have to pay it back. So it can be a drain on the company medium to long term. There are a couple other debt funding sources, like if you're already commercial, factoring receivables. Typically it's small relative to the cash needs of the company, so not a big help. There are some asset-based lenders that'll secure it against, like, say, equipment or other things like that. But again, startups tend not to have a lot of that, so it's usually not a good source. And then later stage companies with more resources can also consider cash flow-based lending. It tends to be very expensive. Almost like credit card level interest rates. So you got to ask yourself, like, is it worth tying up the IP and the assets and paying such a high interest rate? Debatable. I don't know. Cheaper than equity probably, but on the downside, it can really put the company in a bad spot.
For sure, investors will have a major say in this. You won't be able to do it because it'll certainly be in front of the investors. So just as you are getting exits, then they get paid first. So debt is ahead of equity. So.
Yeah, and to your point, everyone, the board's got to approve it. All the shareholders, particularly preferred shareholders, have particular thresholds they have to meet. So it's not something an entrepreneur can just go do.
That's why I was just making sure they knew.
Yeah, you need to manage a lot of stakeholders in order to get a deal done and really make the case for why it's appropriate in that situation. That's why I think more typically it's just equity.
Instead of ending on downers, Courtney, I want to make sure everybody knows this is a great time to start a company. There is more money in investing than ever before. The VCs have raised more capital than, partly because, as a limited partner, you're sitting out there and your equities are so high, your small amount, 1% or half of 1% you're supposed to use in high risk investing is growing with that big pot of money. So rather than Bitcoin, everything, they're looking at venture as one way to go. So, and at least in my world, healthcare is a very important place, and it's a pretty secure market. We're going to need more. We're not going to turn it off and switch to a different piece of the industry. It'll always be growing, it seems. So I want to make sure we make that positive statement.
Absolutely. Brian.
A lot of reasons for optimism. I totally agree.
Yeah.
Well, I just want to thank you for your thoughts today and this great discussion. I want to thank the audience for their questions. I thought they had a lot of great questions to enrich the conversation. Yeah, thank you. And to everyone, I think this is the last session of the day. So thank you for spending this hour with us.
Great to see everybody. Take care.
Thanks so much for having me. Appreciate it.
Have a good Memorial Day, everybody. Bye.
Bye.